This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 45 of Here's How. Brexit has continuing fallout on the continent, in Scotland, in London, in Dublin, but what about in the north? Do the seismic shifts have enough power to break the sectarian concrete and shift positions in Belfast?
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Mick Fealty is the founding editor of the Northern Ireland political website Slugger O'Toole. He's been doing that for 14 years, and it's one of the most renowned political websites, certainly in Northern Ireland, probably in the whole of the island of Ireland. Mick, you've been writing a lot about Brexit and the effect in Britain. I'm more interested in what it's going to do to Northern Ireland. And I kind of laughed when I saw a CNN report on the morning of the vote, and there was a breathless reporter on CNN saying that Northern Ireland's First Minister Martin McGuinness has said that he's now in favour of a border poll to possibly reunite Ireland. I think only CNN could make a news item out of the fact that Martin McGuinness is now in favour of a united Ireland. But do you think that a lot of political birds are coming home to roost now, that people are going to be forced to choose what side they are on more than within the Northern Ireland context?
No, I'm quite anti the whole. I think much of the initial reaction's been hysterical to Brexit, and I think that's understandable. It's not just been hysterical in Northern Ireland, it's been even more hysterical right across the island of Britain. Now, my personal feeling is that the effects of Brexit are being exaggerated in the short term, but underestimated in the longer term. Because it's to do with the nature of the European Union, in a sense. It's a customs union. It's a long-term treaty of some 60-odd years in standing. Most of the effects are medium to longer term. Programs like the four various kind of peace funding programs, most of the effects of that will not take place. Now, it's true that some academic institutions are already facing very challenging situations vis-à-vis their funding programs. But Britain hasn't left yet. And in fact, it's not clear what form it will take. Theresa May, I think, has been very clever in terms of how she's pitched it to all the regions. She's playing a very canny, very clever game with Scotland, which is a much higher priority for the UK Prime Minister than Northern Ireland. In part because it's more volatile. One of the great successes of the Good Friday Agreement was to set up the least volatile political institutions in these islands. And of course they needed to be, because they needed to pin together such opponents as the late Dr. Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party and of course Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness's Sinn Féin. Previously these were political parties which during the Troubles were deadly enemies. And what they've managed to do is to create an institution which is inert enough, not to allow those two political parties not simply to work together, but to signal to their extreme bases, if you like, that it was possible for them to work together. The corollary of that is that it makes their agency in responding to Brexit much more limited, of course, because one is for Brexit, the other one is against Brexit. One is for a United Ireland poll, the other one is against it. And that effectively allows them to cancel each other out.
Hold on for a second there, Mick. You say, obviously, the Democratic Unionists are against a border poll and don't want anything to move closer to the south. Are you sure that they're really in favour of Brexit? An awful lot of people in Britain seem to have buyer's remorse, and there seem to be at least a low level of awareness what Brexit would mean amongst Leave voters. Might that be true of the DUP as well?
Well, let's not exaggerate the effect. I think the reason why people, voters in Britain, or it became a story that voters in Britain were having some buyer's regret, that I'm sure that's true. I'm also sure that it's pretty true that after every single election, some voters have such buyer's regret that they misremember who they actually voted for. There was a poll just after the election that found, when it asked who people had voted for, it found a slight majority in favour of remaining. So some people clearly, just 2 days after the poll, had forgotten what they'd actually done. And in a poll with just a 2%, or a 4% margin between leaving and remaining, that's clearly going to be a story. I really don't think, in terms of the DUP, I know for a fact there were individuals who personally, on a very personal level, would have been in favour of remaining. Some of the younger and more liberal MLAs, so to speak. But I really don't think, and people have speculated about Arlene Foster coming from a farming background, a farming community, herself not being hard Brexit. But now we have Theresa May, who campaigned, however lightly, in favour of remaining.
She kept her head
down.
down.
She's now in charge of a Brexit, a Brexit government.
Mm-hmm.
So in some respects, it doesn't really matter what individuals, even if the party leader is soft, they own that position in a sense, and that's the position that the DUP will take. Sinn Féin will take the counter position. The truth about the First and Deputy First Minister's job is that they are joint heads of the Northern Ireland administration. One cannot act without acting in concert with the other. And in a sense, that's one of Northern Ireland's insurances, that if there's not a consensus between them, then neither of them can really provide a kind of an activist line on any given subject. And that remains true of Brexit. And it also remains true of whether an All-Ireland poll is called on foot of Brexit.
On a poll, do you think, maybe not in politics, but in wider society, that there exist any unionists at all who would be convinced by the prospect of Brexit to think that a united Ireland might be a better thing?
I'll be careful how I answer that, because I don't think it has clinched the argument. I think the arguments are a long way from being made in the constructive way that they need to be made in order to do that. But I think the real kind of shift is that having an Irish passport, which everyone who is born in Northern Ireland is entitled to, guarantees European citizenship. So there is there's anecdotal evidence that people right across Northern Ireland have been taking up their possibility of having an Irish passport. And that's one of those softer questions. This is why I say that in a sense everyone at the moment is exaggerating the near-term effects, but that's one of those longer-term cultural effects that, a future census is likely to show that there has been an increased uptake in Irish passport.
So if you're a young person, for example, from a unionist background, who's minded to go even just backpacking around Europe, or perhaps getting a job, working in a bar in Spain, or doing something like that, whereas your parents might have recoiled in revulsion at the idea of taking out an Irish passport, you're quite tempted to do so.
Quite, because now we can't speculate ahead of what the Brexit deal would be, because it may make very generous provisions as far as freedom of movement is concerned. It really depends on where we are in 3, 4, or 5 years' time. But were it to be the case that freedom of movement, and particularly freedom of labour, were curtailed, then having Irish citizenship would have a significantly enhanced quality to it. It would have a logic. It would have a choice, a logical choice to it, in the sense that would encourage many pragmatic unionists just to make that choice to become Irish citizens, or to take up their option of being an Irish citizen because they have it as a birthright. So that's a soft thing. But in absence of a critical pitch from the Irish nationalist parties, both North and South, because remember, any unification would require two separate referenda, one in the North and one in the South.
There's no guarantee that people in the South would be falling over themselves to accommodate the North either, is there?
No, there's not. Although my personal working assumption is that many people would be hard put to refuse it. But the point is nobody in the South or the North is really consistent. And this actually includes Sinn Féin in this, who have, to be fair to them, been the only party who have been consistently publicising this option and championing it. But their North-South policy base is virtually non-existent. It consists of gaining power in Dublin and retaining power in Belfast, and then somehow building a bridge between the two places. But it also implies that what they're currently doing is not really building a cross-border platform, in the sense that, infrastructural projects become important. Mm-hmm. Some of their activists in Monaghan and Cavan are currently blocking an electric interconnector. They're rather than the party championing.
This would be a connector across the border. In fairness, I think they're blocking it because of either environmental or NIMBY complaints, rather than for any kind of cross-border reason.
Quite so, and to be even fairer to them, the proposal hasn't been made concrete enough for that to come forward. But they're not. But what I'm saying is that if the United Ireland programme is going to work, then the pitch for electrification, particularly in the west of the Republic, counties like Donegal, which are almost entirely surrounded by Northern Ireland, require substantial cross-border investment. And making that pitch for the western counties of Northern Ireland and the very west counties of the Republic has been most noticeable by its absence.
Which are Sinn Féin heartlands. I want to come on to maybe the UK negotiations with Europe in a moment, but just one thing specifically on what's happening, kind of the mood within Northern Ireland. There is a possibility that this will shake out into a second and possibly successful independence referendum in Scotland. Would you agree that all bets are off if the UK breaks up, that's to say Scotland becomes independent?
No, I wouldn't entirely. I mean, I'm a bit of I think we Irish would love to see, in our little free souls, we would love to see Scotland breaking away. And that makes us slightly unreliable witnesses in terms of what the likelihood of that is in the first place. So I think it's a distinct possibility, but I think it's a little bit like Sisyphus. They've got a very heavy rock to get up that mountain. Mm-hmm. SNP's become very popular since the last independence referendum. I'm not sure that just leaving the European Union is going to be sufficient trigger to make up that shortfall of something like in excess of 500,000 voters to get it across the line. Mm-hmm. But all bets are off, kind of, but not quite.
But surely unionists, when they say that they're unionists, a lot of that feeling is cultural, and the union for them very frequently is more with Scotland than with, let's say, England and Wales.
Yes, that is very true. And look, if it were to happen, again, I think most of the effects will be in the medium to longer term. It's that whole classic thing about technology that everybody exaggerates the effect in the short term, but underestimates it in the longer term. I think culturally, over a long period of time, yes, that will have an effect. But we have to resile to the political reality of Northern Ireland. It's only going to create dynamism within Northern Ireland once the political parties in the north have had created sufficient sea change within the north to kind of release people from their historical identities, enough for them to start cross-dressing, if you like, switching from one certainty to the possibility of another certainty. And we can kind of, like Winston Churchill's famous quote about the, when the tides of conflict have withdrawn, then the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone will still be locked in the integrity of their historical trouble.
Yep.
So a worldwide conflagration goes on. The Ulster Division goes to fight in the Somme alongside, Dubliners and Munstermen, and they die in their thousands, and it's all very heroic, and they come back to have a nasty civil war, with the sacking of Catholics from, Lisburn, and they come back to the integrity of their old struggles.
Okay. I want to move on to, just for a little bit, the, negotiations that the UK will have to have with what will be the EU 27. That's to say, all of the EU minus Britain. Michael Gove, on the morning of the referendum, perhaps when he thought he was going to be Prime Minister, said that there's no hurry triggering Article 50, and then a little bit later he said, entirely wrongly, he said that there was no need to use Article 50 for the UK, to leave the EU. They could just have an informal arrangement. He was very quickly slapped down on both of those, and now Theresa May is Prime Minister, and seems like she's in no hurry to trigger it either. The longer this goes on, the more the UK looks foolish, isn't it? I mean, they can't march their troops up to the top of the hill and march them back down again. But once they trigger it, they have a 2-year ticking clock. Any deal requires a super qualified majority. That's to say 20 of the 27 remaining countries representing 2/3 of the population must agree. And whatever deal happens within 2 years is what the UK gets. That's an incredibly weak negotiating position for them, isn't it?
It would be if they were to do it immediately. This is one reason why Gove came out with all of that. And what many of the Brexiteers did in the immediate wake, but also prior to slightly prior to the referendum, but certainly immediately afterwards, was that they basically said, that's a noose. We're not going to put our head in that noose. As soon as you put it in there, you're going to hang us as quickly as you possibly can, and you're going to leave us with absolutely nothing. So from a British point of view, it makes an awful lot of sense for them to shilly-shally, to push the event back, to have a lot of, as many pre-negotiations as they possibly can. Remember, one of the things...
Sure, it makes sense for them not to put their head in the noose, and I agree with you, in many respects it is a noose, but the France and Germany in particular are able to say, well, if you're not triggering Article 50, then fine, that's up to you. But that's likely to cause a democratic crisis within Britain, in London. And Theresa May can't force the Europeans to do anything at all until she triggers Article 50. Isn't that true?
That's quite true. But remember that two things have to happen before they trigger Article 50. The British need to figure out what on earth it is they want from this Brexit process, where they want to end up, what kind of conditions they have. Remember,
and there's no evidence that they have any good idea of that, is there?
No, and in a sense, the campaign doesn't leave them any clues. The campaign could be a massive hostage to fortune. Two major things were promised. One, that the United Kingdom would regain sovereignty, and that's effectively a pitch that conservative Brexiteers
nobody really knows what that means, do they?
Sorry?
Nobody really knows what that means, do they?
No, but you could sell just pulling out of the European Union and saying we're not sending people there anymore, we're not making their laws, we're not making European laws anymore, and we're not transferring big chunks of cash directly to the Brussels institution. That would probably be sufficient for people in the Tory heartlands. However, that is not the totality of what the Brexiteers promised during the referendum campaign. They also promised that they were going to deal with immigration. They're going to put immigration controls. The real nasty paradox of this is that's not a huge concern for most Tory voting areas. who don't have massive influx of immigrants.
Are you sure that's true? Are you sure that's true? Because the hostility to immigrants is actually directly reversely proportional to the number of immigrants that people meet. The hostility to immigrants is highest in little English villages where, they haven't seen a black face in decades, to put it crudely. People who live in London and which is an enormously multi-ethnic city with successive generations of immigrants, voted strongly to remain, and there are there's little constituency for either UKIP or, when it was the fashion of the day, the BNP.
Right. No, I don't agree with that. I think it's part of the overall picture, but the overall picture is slightly more complex than that. I think if you talk to people in the Tory heartlands, the people who voted because of immigration are electricians, tradesmen, non-skilled labourers who are in direct competition.
Margaret Thatcher's C2s.
The C2s, absolutely. And the C2s are,
I should explain that for the listeners. C2 is a social class, and it means essentially painters, electricians, skilled manual workers. And when Margaret Thatcher was making demographic targeting in order to win the election, her line was, the C2s will see to it. In other words, those people who were working class but more personally involved in the economics of their own business would be vulnerable to switching to voting Tory, which they did. Sorry, Mick, go ahead.
No, absolutely. And listen, we also know from Irish politics that the C2s are probably the real dynamism behind the volatility of public politics in Dublin, for instance, work class Dublin. Mm-hmm. Where the whole party loyalty thing is just breaking up massively.
And so are you saying that in the UK, essentially the C2s, that class of people, see, for example, Polish immigrants coming in and competing with them and driving down their wages? Yes,
that is a live part of. Now, the truth is, in the first part, this is another thing for your voters who may not be familiar with the dynamism of first past the vote. The post system. What first past the post does, it's non-proportional. In other words, it's like the US presidential election. You've got two major candidates who run against each other, and it's whoever gets the most votes wins. So, like, for instance, in South Belfast in the last Westminster election.
You need a plurality, not a majority. So as long as you have one vote more than the guy who comes in second, doesn't matter how many votes whoever came in third or fourth. And the one example of that was that David Cameron won a majority in the last UK general election with 36% of the vote. But the no campaign in the marriage referendum in Ireland were seen to have been roundly defeated with 38% of the vote.
That's correct. So for large swathes of Tory heartland, Conservative Party heartland, you've got places where they just have votes all stacked up. It's the same for the Labour Party too. And that Tory base will be largely happy with something that the Tories can argue is a repatriation of sovereignty from the European Union. And exiting the Union, in a sense, will do that. In a very simple sense, it will do that. Not dealing with immigration is more of a problem for the Labour Party, because it's affecting more of their base than it is of the Conservative base. And also what you've got coming up, and certainly if there's not another election until 2010, there will be boundary changes which will further penalise the British Labour Party. So in a sense, going weak or not doing a sufficiently strong deal on immigration will hurt the British Labour Party more than it will hurt the British Conservative Party. So it could be tempting for May to go soft on immigration and protect trade deals through, going for an EEA or Norwegian-style deal. Politically speaking, in the domestic base, creates more problems for her opponent, who was pro-Remain regardless of everything, unless a new and radical Labour Party leader resiles to a Brexit position and basically says, look, if we're going to do this thing, then we need to prioritise protecting workers and employment for native British workers, if you like. That seems highly unlikely, given the flux within the Labour Party, that's going to happen in any effective terms. So the Conservative Party here domestically has some considerable wriggle room in terms of what they finally push out. Bear in mind also that Theresa May has signalled that she's going to make a priority of trying to keep Scotland in the Union. And as I said before, I think Scotland is much more of a dynamic problem. It's radicalised. It's been split already through the previous independence referendum. Scottish Labour is already kind of on its uppers. She's prioritising keeping them in. So kind of finding some form of Brexit that not allows Scotland to live with it, but weakens any potential cards that the SNP might want to play vis-a-vis a second independence referendum. Then she has some considerable play on this.
One last question, Mick. What should the Irish government be pressing when they're part of the other side of the table, essentially, in the negotiations with the UK? Do you think it's just plain and simply keep the UK as close as possible in order to minimise the disruption with the North? Yes. I think Dublin has two priorities. One is to keep the border absolutely wide open. Now, I personally think that in Theresa May, they've met someone they can absolutely do a deal with on that. Colm Eastwood, who's the new leader of the SDLP in Northern Ireland, put it rather poetically, but rather descriptively well, in which he said, we don't want a reimposition of a border across the island. If we need it anywhere, it should be around the island. And I think that's something that not only can the British government live with, I think unionists in the North can live with that as well, that they have to show their passports when they come into Heathrow, which by and large they kind of have to do already, that there are customs checks at Liverpool. Liverpool, I think, is Liverpool and Stranraer are the two major kind of these are the ferry ports.
And I think that most of the objectives in the North-South stuff are doable in terms of the big ticket political stuff.
Do you think that very last question, do you think that the Tory party ideologues could tolerate any crowbarring of Northern Ireland out of the Union, however minor, but could they tolerate that principle being breached?
Yes.
They just don't care enough?
No, it's not that. I mean, I think the reason why unionists can live with it, if unionists can live with it, then the Tory right will live with it. They basically take their nod from their unionist friends. And the reason for it partly is because we've been here before. The Prevention of Terrorism Act created a false border between Northern Ireland and the island of Britain during the Troubles, in which literally this is true.
The security measures were effectively more or less the same as when you were crossing an international border anyway.
Quite so, and they were quite draconian. So as even with a UK passport, if you were living in Britain and were suspected, not convicted, but just suspected of terrorism, the police could come, drag you from your house, put you on a plane or a boat and say, right, you're out of here, you're staying in Northern Ireland, you come into Britain, we'll get you. And so the North has been accustomed to a kind of a Chinese wall, if you like, between Britain and Northern Ireland from the time of partition onwards, but certainly from the imposition of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, I think in 1971. So I think they can live with all of that. I think we exaggerate all of that. I think the other priority for Britain for Dublin has got to be the maintenance of East-West trade. There has been a massive increase in Ireland's foreign trade since accession to the European Union. It has massively diversified, has trade with America and the rest of the European Union, but Britain remains its biggest single trading partner. And so all of that has got to be, that's got to be prioritized in terms of negotiation. Short-term wins, if there's an insufficiently good deal done around finance and the banking passporting system, Dublin is already being flagged by major European banking institutions as a first port of call in terms of bringing services to Dublin. So there's going to be some windfalls from this. It's not going to be all negative for Dublin, but essentially those will be short term. Those will be short term wins. Dublin needs to focus exactly where its long-term strategic advantages are going to arise from by Britain leaving. There should be an enhanced win around FDI, English-speaking companies from the US wanting to settle, intensifying that kind of tracking in and finding ways of, if you like, exploiting that, because in a sense, Ireland may well become the only English-speaking option within the European Union, and finding ways to fiscally exploit
with the possible exception of Malta.
Yes,
Mick Fealty, founding editor of SluggerO'Toole.com. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
If you liked the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
That's almost the end of episode 45 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 1st of August 2016. But before you go, some news. Here's How has been longlisted for the Blog Awards Ireland. If you'd like to vote to get the podcast put on the shortlist, then follow the link to the voting page. There's also a link to Mick Fealty's blog, Slugger O'Toole, in this podcast's show notes on the website, along with lots more information. If you can think of a topic that you think should be covered in the next show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, follow Mick Fealty @Mick Fealty, and follow his blog @Slugger O'Toole, and subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. If you don't know how to do that, there is step-by-step instructions along with contact details at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Don't forget to vote, and thank you for listening.